Greetings internet, it's Monica, and today I am so excited because I am doing a video all about my top 10 favorite books of all time. I have been so excited to make this video because I realized that I've never made this like definitive list before on my channel, and yeah, I just really wanted to talk about some books that I love. Now, I didn't include in this list nostalgia favorites, so books that I first read and fell in love with as a child, and I also didn't include classics. So if you would like to see a video all about my favorite classics, let me know and I can make that happen at some point in life. And I also thought it would be fun if after watching this video and seeing what my top 10 books are, if you have any recommendations for books that you think I would love based on this list. And maybe I'll do like a TBR based off of some of your suggestions. I remember Lala from Books and Lala did a video kind of like that, and I loved watching it, so thought I would borrow that idea. Before I jump into the 10 books that I chose for this video, I do want to give a big thank you to this video's sponsor, which is Skillshare. So I love Skillshare. I've been using them for quite a while now. Skillshare is an online learning community where millions of people come together to take the next step in their creative journey, with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and so much more. So I don't know if you guys know who Matt Bellassai is, but I think he is hilarious. He used to be part of BuzzFeed Video, and then he ended up leaving and now creates his own content, and he actually has a whole class on Skillshare about writing content for social media. It has been really helpful as a marketer and someone who does freelance marketing to just get insights from his experience from working at BuzzFeed and creating so many viral videos. So that has been so amazing for me. If you would like to give Skillshare Premium a try, I will have a link in the description box below where you can get a free trial. Now, without further ado, I'm going to dive on into the books, and these aren't in any particular order, but the first book that I want to talk about is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy, and I love this series because it was really that bridge book for me that got me from YA fantasy into adult fantasy and just made me fall even deeper in love with what the fantasy genre could be. I absolutely adored this story. I loved the plotting and the magic system. They're just impeccable. Brandon Sanderson is just so good at those two things particularly. The premise of this novel is right here on the cover. It says, "What if the Dark Lord won?" So basically it takes place in this world where hundreds of years ago there was a chosen one and a villain, and the villain won, and this takes place in that society a few hundred years down the road. And it's absolutely fascinating, and I loved what he explores in this story and the way that he builds this world. Vin is definitely one of my favorite characters of all time. I just love her, and Ellen. Oh, so good, so good. The first book in the series is a heist novel, and it kept me totally gripped from beginning to end and just really made me excited for fantasy and reading more fantasy. So I love this one. Highly recommend it for anyone who is, thinks they would be into fantasy but isn't sure where to start. I think this is a great starting point because it's super accessible. The next book I want to talk about is If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha, which is a novel translated from Korean. It follows 4 Korean women living in an apartment complex together, and all their different lives that also intersect. And I just loved the women in this story. I loved getting to know each of them. I honestly would love it to be a series or something. I want more about them. I fell so in love with this group of women by the end. It also, if you guys have watched Hello My 20s, that's like one of my favorite K-dramas of all time. It gave me Hello My 20s vibes, but like darker. I just loved this novel. I loved that you got a little bit of an insight into what it means to be a woman in Korea today, especially when it comes to the really intense beauty standards and strict social hierarchies. So yeah, I loved this book so much. It was such a fantastic read and definitely one that I think about pretty consistently ever since I first read it. Next is Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo. I knew a Leigh Bardugo book was going to be on this list. I just wasn't sure which one. It was honestly between this one and Ninth House, but the Grisha series is one that is so incredibly near and dear to my heart that I had to choose one of those books. And I ended up going with Siege and Storm because this particular book introduces one of my all-time favorite characters, Nikolai Lantsov. His introduction in this novel and then seeing where he goes from this novel is just so amazing. I just love it so much. But yeah, I love the Grisha trilogy and all of the spin-off novels. I do think that the Grisha trilogy doesn't get enough love or credit, though. I feel like it's often sort of talked about as like, you know, not as good as the rest of her work, but I think it's brilliant. And every time I've reread it, I found new and interesting things to think about and talk about. It definitely is sort of from a specific era in YA fantasy and it has those tropes, but I think it tackles all those tropes in a way that even today is still fresh and fun to read about. So I love Leigh Bardugo. I love the Grisha universe. So I just had to include one of these, and yeah, it's just definitely a favorite. Also, these new covers are stunning, but these Netflix stickers that aren't actually stickers are not. My next book is another novel that takes place in Korea, and that is Pachinko. This is a multi-generational novel that follows a Korean family. We start following this girl when she's 16 years old, sort of on the cusp of Japan's attempt to colonize Korea, and then also then World War II, and we see her immigrate from Korea to Japan, and much of the novel really explores what it means to be a Korean in another country, and you know, especially as a Korean person living in Japan, the racism that her and her family faced while there. And I loved this book so much. I feel like for me personally, it gave me so much context and history behind my own background that I really hadn't had before, like outside of just sort of a factual level. Like, this gave me so much more depth to understand my family, like where my family comes from, so much more. Like, my mom was born at the end of the Korean War basically, and so, you know, my whole existence is because of colonization, and you know, that's definitely a weird thing to talk about and think about. There's this word in Korean called han that is meant to describe a sort of innate sorrow and bitterness, which is kind of part of the essence of what it means to feel and be Korean. And this book is the first book that I think, like, that I've read that really got that for me and depicted that for me in a novel form. I don't know if I'm explaining that right, but it's so good. And even if you're not Korean, I highly recommend it because it is just such a compelling story about this family living through this incredibly horrible history that in the West, in our school systems, we definitely do not learn anything about. So it was just, even from that perspective, I think a wide variety of readers would find this really fascinating and definitely a page turner to read. Now, this next one that I'm going to talk about is going to come as no surprise to anybody who watches my channel, and that is The Diviners by Libba Bray. I love The Diviners. I have been rooting for this book to one day be adapted because I think it would make the most amazing show of all time. But basically, The Diviners is set in 1920s New York City, follows a group of teens who all discover that they have these divine abilities, like being able to read objects or dream walk or heal. And I don't know, I love the story. I love these characters. I love what Libba, like when Libba wrote this story, she was telling the ghost story of America. and I think she does such a fantastic job at that. And in, you know, using the 1920s to put a lens on 2020 America, I think she does a phenomenal job at all of those things. And I just also love the characters in this story, especially Evie O'Neill. She's definitely one of my all-time favorite literary characters because honestly, I relate so much to her, and I just adored reading about her for all 4 books in this series. So yeah, this is definitely a lifelong favorite for me, and I can't believe the series is finally over. I'm so sad about that, but I loved getting to reread this one recently with so many of you, which was a wonderful experience. So yeah, if you haven't read The Diviners yet, I don't know. This next one is, I think, the newest book that I'm including on this list, and I almost didn't include it because I haven't finished the series, but honestly, even if the rest of the series isn't good, this first book was so superior that I had to include it regardless, and that is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. It is a fantasy novel that takes place in a world that keeps having natural disasters, and sort of the world just kind of ends every few decades. And in this story, you follow 3 women, well, 2 women and 1 young girl, as they each go on 3 different journeys to, you know, some sort of endpoint. And I honestly would not go looking for any more information outside of that when it comes to this book, because I just think the journey of it is so amazing. And also, I don't think there is a good way to give a summary of this book. Like, so much happens that is just like, that summary I just gave is like scratching the surface. But it's such an amazing ride. I will say that the first like 80 or so pages were rough to get through. Like, I didn't think that I was smart enough to get through them, not gonna lie. I just remember reading it and being like, I think my brain is too smooth for this, but I persevered, and I'm so glad I did because I absolutely adored it. And honestly, this is a fantasy novel that, like, if Brandon Sanderson's The Final Empire sort of brought me into the fantasy world and made me fall in love with the genre, this sort of elevated the genre for me, and like elevated what the genre of fantasy could even be. So yeah, I just love this book so much. Next, I have Nevermore by Jessica Townsend. This is the first book in the series, which is The Trials of Morrigan Crow, and it is a middle grade series. However, I think this could really appeal to readers of all ages. Basically, we follow Morrigan, who is 11 years old, and she is blamed for all of the bad things that happened in her town. On her 11th birthday, she is supposed to die, but instead she is whisked away by this mysterious magical stranger called Jupiter North, and she's brought into this new world where she is then set on this quest to complete these trials in order to gain access to a secret society for people with wondrous abilities. So I love this story. I just think it's so whimsical and fun. It really just builds such an immaculate and enthralling world that I miss every time I finish reading one of these stories, and I'm so excited because the 3rd one comes out so soon. But yeah, I definitely recommend, if you have any kids in your life, this is definitely a book that you should pick up for them, and honestly, you should also pick it up for yourself because it is that good. Next, I have The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness. This is, I wasn't sure which Patrick Ness book I was going to include in this video. It was another one like Leigh Bardugo where I knew a Patrick Ness book had to be in there because I love his story so much. I just love that he takes such risks, I feel like, with every book that he writes, and this one was no exception. This book takes place in an extraordinary world, but we follow ordinary people. In this world, there are chosen ones, and every year at school there seems to be some new huge villain that the chosen ones have to battle, whether that be vampires or aliens or ghosts or what have you. But this novel does not follow the chosen ones at all or any of their adventures, other than a few like blurbs. Basically, at the start of each chapter you get like one paragraph that kind of gives a little hint at what's going on with the chosen ones, but that's it. Otherwise, we're just following the people who who are living their day-to-day lives. And this novel I actually think is probably one of his most slept on. I feel like when it came out it didn't get the best reviews, but I just loved it from like the get-go. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I love the idea of exploring what it means to just be an average everyday person living your life, even if you're living through extraordinary or horrible events. And honestly, I think this one would be a really interesting one to read today in 2020 with everything going on. It kind of does feel like the world is ending every day, but yet, you know, all the mundane parts of life still continue, and you know, you still have to work on relationships and deal with bad grades or work or whatever, and this story kind of explores that, and I just think it's so brilliantly done. I absolutely love it, and I love Patrick Ness's stories in general. I also just so related to Mikey in this book. Mikey has OCD, and he also really struggles with anxiety when it comes to his relationships with his friends. One of the things that I think about a lot in this story is how Mikey fears that the people that love him don't actually know him, and if they did actually know him, that they wouldn't love him anymore. And that is a feeling that I have felt so intensely in the past and still do, and so for me, I loved that element in this book. It meant a lot to me as a reader. This next one is a little bit of a cheat because it is kind of a nostalgia pick. However, I've read it since then and I love it so much, I just had to include it. It's The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. This is a perfect novel, in my opinion. It's a perfect novel. It's a perfect film adaptation. I don't even care if Emma Watson's American accent is a little weird. I love the film even more because of that. But yeah, I love this book so much. It means so much to me. I love Charlie. I love how soft and kind he is and earnest. I love how the characters in this story feel so honest and real. For me as a teen reading it for the first time, I remember just feeling seen and accepted and loved by this book, which was a revolutionary feeling for me when it came to reading. And every time I watch the film or reread the novel, which I do pretty consistently actually, it just makes me feel all things. And I also really value this book's representation when it comes to trauma, and specifically trauma that men have to deal with when it comes to assault. I don't think that is talked about nearly enough, and I think that this book handles it so graciously, and it just, yeah, I love The Perks of Being a Wallflower a lot. And then the last book I want to talk about is How to Build a Girl by Caitlin Moran. This is the first book in a series, and the second one actually just came out a few months ago, so I still have to pick that up. But I loved this first installment. Basically, we follow Joanna Morrigan from when she is a preteen to her late teens. And when she's young, a preteen, she embarrasses herself pretty badly on local television. And from that point on, she goes on this journey to reinvent herself as Dolly Wilde, what does she refer to herself as? A lady sex adventurer. So as Dolly, she ends up getting involved with this rock and roll magazine, and she writes reviews for them. And as she falls into this world, she ends up sort of becoming or putting on this facade of being incredibly jaded in order to fit in and be seen as cool in this world. And you see her kind of lose herself in order to be part of this cool crowd of people. And it's such a good coming of age story. I feel like girls don't get coming of age stories like this that often. I would definitely compare this to the film Almost Famous, except set in the 90s or 80s. I forget, I think 90s. Would compare this to Almost Famous. Also Charles Bukowski's Ham on Rye series. I would also recommend this to people who like Daisy Jones and the Six, or if you didn't like Daisy Jones and the Six, I would also recommend this one because I think it's a lot better. But also I didn't really like Daisy Jones, so I might be biased, but yeah, I love this book. It also just got an adaptation, and Beanie Feldstein plays Joanna, and she's amazing in it. Even she does, I will say, her accent is a little bit jarring at the beginning, but as it goes on, it just blended into the background for me. But yeah, I love this book. I love the adaptation now. It was also just like lovely to have like a plus size girl in a film and not have her like journey be about her weight at all. That was great. So really enjoyed that. But yeah, I highly recommend both. So these are my favorite books of all time. I had so much fun putting this list of books together. Again, I'd love to hear from you guys. What are some of your favorite books of all time? And also, if you do have any recommendations, let me know in the comments down below, and I will hopefully do a fun TBR based on those recommendations. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye!